Afternoon, everybody. I appreciate you joining us again for another webinar about government contracting. I've got two great guests today. Got WinBiz and Samir Patel from Mobilization Capital. They're going to get into the contracting world, so we're going to jump right into it. My name is Brandon Skolnick, the champion of small business. If you're from Atlanta, you've probably met me at a networking meeting. I'm out all the time. And so how we're going to interact today, if you look over to the right side of your screen, you'll see a little chat box. If you have any comments or questions, go ahead and shoot them in there. You can also tweet at WinBizProps, that's for WinBiz, and hashtag YouWinWeFund, and hashtag WinWithWinBiz. All right. Who is this webinar for? Who are these webinars for? These are for people that never won a contract because they're afraid to bid, or because they're just not really aware of how the contracting process works. Maybe you've won a bid but struggled to perform due to any number of reasons, and then maybe you've won too many. A lot of times you throw your seeds out there, and then all of a sudden you get a big break, but you weren't able to really fund them, or kind of pull the right team together to execute on it. So this is something you need to think about. You know, if you're going to get into government contracting, you need to float yourself monetarily for 2 to 3 months as soon as you win and begin to perform on that government contract. And if you don't have the right team in place, the right finances in place, you can set yourself up for failure. So the reason we put on these webinars is so that we can kind of provide you some insight. All right, so let's meet our first presenter. This is Jennifer Deli, CEO and founder of WinBiz Proposals, coming out of Washington, D.C. Jennifer, welcome aboard.
Great, thanks for having me.
All right.
So again, thanks for having me. Really excited to present a little bit about the upfront, the step that Brandon talked about, maybe being afraid to bid. As you can see there on the presentation, I have 20 years of experience working with government contractors, have an MBA from Georgetown, and our business is singularly focused on working with small and mid-sized government contractors to help you win more business, to help you bid on proposals, and basically bring the resources that the large guys have to the smaller companies like yourself who are breaking in. Next slide, please. So today we're going to cover 5 main topics, which is basically to get you going on bidding on government contracts. This applies to an experienced government contractor as well as a new entry into the market. Basically, we're going to cover a little bit about what we call the bidder's dilemma, that really good problem that you have where there's too many opportunities. And when you have so many opportunities, you also have to ask yourself, how can I prioritize? Finally, how much is it going to cost me, both in terms of hours and money? Who can work on my proposal? And then finally, I've looked at all of this and I still have some gaps. I don't know where to go from here. And we're going to talk you through all of those. Okay, let's talk about that really good problem to have, which is so many opportunities, so little time. Especially if your company is sub, let's say, $50 million, you probably have the executive team being intimately involved with writing your own proposals. If you're really truly startup, you're probably doing it at the kitchen table after you've put in a full day of business and you've gone to your kid's soccer game and you've eaten dinner, and then you're writing a proposal at 11 o'clock at night. So what we try to do is work with companies to say, how can you whittle down to those opportunities that are most valuable to go after? And the first step to do that is to establish balance in your pipeline. It's really, really tempting to go after the next new shiny object. And then you find yourself burning out either in time or energy or budget or in all 3. Now, there's a number of ways that you can make sure that your pipeline is healthy, but I'm going to talk about the top 3 factors to consider first. First, we want to take a look at making sure you have a healthy ratio between your contract vehicles and your single awards. Now, I'm going to pause here and say that I'm going to probably throw in a lot of GovCon jargon here. If you don't, if you have any questions about the terminology or the methodologies that I threw out here in this really short presentation, feel free to contact me after, either by email or by tweet or by calling me, and I'd be happy to go over those with you. So what you see on your screen there, contract vehicles versus single awards. Contract vehicle is essentially a ticket to the dance. That enables you to bid on subsequent work, but first you have to get that ticket. So a contract vehicle can take a lot of time and money and energy, and they can take a long time to award. There are lots and lots of vehicles out there that might take 6 months to submit the proposal, but you have to wait at least a year to get that award. And then you have to propose all over again to actually win the business. Now, that's not to say you should not have contract vehicles. You definitely should, but they take a long time to come to fruition. So while you're pursuing those, make sure that you have that balance with the single awards as well. And those are going to be the contracts that have immediate revenue. The government has said, we need this project done, we need this many people, and by bidding and winning on that work, you're going to have to start kicking off within a few weeks. And that's really a lot of the focus of the webinar today. A second thing that you should have balance on in your pipeline is the ratio between opportunities where you're going in as a prime or maybe as the only contractor, or opportunities where you're going in as a subcontractor on a larger team. Now, as a startup, you're probably going to have mostly subcontractor opportunities, and that's primarily because the government is looking for past performance. So if your company is less than 3 years old, most government contracts require you to have 3 years of past performance. So if you are just starting out, you don't have those 3 years yet. Well, how do you get them? You get them by being a sub. The other great thing about being a subcontractor is that you have large company primes that you can learn from. You can even form formal mentor-protege relationships so that they can share lessons learned with you. They can share their management practices, recruiting practices, things like that to help you grow. Now, once your company gets to that mid-growth cycle, you're going to start to see a healthier balance of around a 50-50 ratio of sub versus prime roles. So now we know that you're starting to get your hooks into the market, agencies are starting to recognize you, and you have your own past performance that you can use to leverage in your proposal to win that business all on your own. And in return, you're probably going to have subs working under you instead of you working under somebody else. And then finally, when you're a mature company, you're going to have a ratio that's more like 20% subcontractor, 80% prime. Now, notice that I didn't say you should go to 100% prime. I would never recommend that as a role because subcontracting is a really good way to expand into new markets, learn new services, try out new services, and really get a sense for where to grow your company in the future. Subcontracting is also a healthy way where as your company grows and you start to outgrow that small business set-aside standard, you may need to be a sub to maintain some of that work when you're now a large business. And then finally, the third factor on balancing your pipeline is going to be incumbency versus new work. So it's important that although it's so fun and so invigorating to chase the new work, and it's shiny and it's exciting and it's cutting edge, but don't forget to protect your base. And by that I mean that when you're building your pipeline, I've seen companies forget to include things like recompeting for option years or recompeting for the subsequent version of that IDIQ that they're on. And then before you know it, sneaks up on them and they're not prepared to protect their base. And then all of a sudden they find themselves in a vulnerable position. It's far easier and less time intense to maintain your existing business than it is to chase after new business. And on the bottom there, when you revisit this webinar later on YouTube, you're going to see that there's a link to a blog that we discuss this in a little bit more detail. Next slide. Okay, so now that we know that you have a healthy balance and you've got all these opportunities, oh my gosh, where do I start? So it's really tempting to be hyper-focused on when the RFPs are going to drop. And we've actually seen clients spend a lot of time debating between, is this RFP going to drop on the 1st, or is it going to drop on the 10th, or is it going to drop on the 21st? And we argue that that actual when date, that calendar date, is less important than generally knowing the quarter or the month that it's expected in. And you guys probably know that the government loves to delay their acquisitions. And especially right now with the change of a presidential administration and the change in leadership in all these agencies, we're going to see a lot of RFPs start to slide to the right a little bit. So what we'd like to say is that don't worry about the individual calendar date that it's going to drop on because it's probably not accurate. Instead, let's talk about prioritization by groups. Instead of going, this is number one, this is number two, number three, we've actually seen clients have really good success with grouping them in buckets. That enables you to say these 5 or maybe these 10 opportunities, depending on how big your pipeline is, these are all equally important to us. That also frees your company from having infighting where executive Joe is fighting with executive Jane over which one should get top billing. This puts them on an even playing field within the company to say, we all have group A opportunities. And then once you've got those prioritized, then you start to look at them and say, oh my gosh, all of our group A's are gonna hit in Q2. What do we need to do to prepare for that? Next slide. So now that you know what's in your pipeline, you have a healthy balance, you know when they're roughly going to arrive, start to think about how much effort is it going to take to bid on these? Do I really have the people and the budget and the time to bid on all of my group A's or all of my group B's? Again, we have a resource here available for you. We dubbed it our quick and dirty B&P calculator, and it will help you determine the hours that you need to write on any given proposal. Now, all you need to do is go in here and estimate roughly the number of pages that the proposal is going to be, how many days you have to turn it around, how many graphics, how much editing is it going to need, and things like that. And using our industry best practices and what we've seen in the real world, we're giving you a rough order of magnitude of the corresponding labor hours. And then what you do is that if you're using total time accounting, which we always recommend that you do that when you're evaluating your business development budget, you're then going to apply those labor hours to your internal labor rate for those roles, make sure that it's fully loaded so you're not fooling yourself on the true cost, and then you're going to know how much that proposal is going to cost you. So you might look at an opportunity and say, oh, this one's going to be so easy. It's only 30 days, it's only 30 pages, and then you start to look at it and you go, oh my God, when I apply our labor rates, this is going to cost me 50 grand to pursue. And then you might step back and ask yourself, does it make sense to do that? Maybe we have another opportunity that has a higher dollar value that we should prioritize. Next slide. Okay, now we know what's in our pipeline. We know what is our priority. We roughly know how long and how much it's going to cost us to go after that proposal. But I don't know who's actually available to write that thing. So, you know, I mentioned up front that we see with small and mid-sized companies that a lot of times the executive team is doing all the heavy lifting. And that's natural. It's understandable because this is your baby. That executive team might be the founders of the company or might be some of the early entrants, and they're closest to the customer, and you're thinking, this is the only person that can write this proposal. But what happens is that becomes a single point of failure. And pretty soon you're making bid decisions based off of people's vacation schedules and based off of their other workload, not on whether or not you're positioned to win that proposal. And you can find that you'll plateau or even retreat because you don't have additional resources to do your proposal. So now, when we're going into the slower, quote unquote, slower season in government acquisition, especially with a potential small pause that we see during a change of presidential administration, this is a great time to look within your broader company and ask yourself, who else can work on our proposals in 2017? Start to look down to the lower level analysts, the subject matter experts, even some of your interns that you might have, and ask yourself, can we give them responsibility related to proposals? Furthermore, look at your overhead functions. You know, proposals always need things like a description of your management approach. They want to know about your recruiting approach. They might want to know how you manage your subcontractors. Well, the folks in your organization that fulfill those roles, they are best suited to write that content in the proposal. So it really makes sure that your proposal reflects your actual business operations. And then, of course, if you're going to ask all these people to work on proposals, you want to incentivize and reward them. So make this part of their upward mobility, use it as an acknowledgement of their key expertise, and then praise them, whether it's by a shout out in a status call or with words or dollars. Next slide, please. And then finally, you've gone through all these steps. You've looked at your pipeline, you've prioritized, you've designed a budget, you looked everywhere, you looked under every seat cushion in your company to find people to work on these proposals, and you're still coming up thin. And that happens all the time. So there's a couple ways you can fill those gaps. The first one is look across your broader team, not within your company, but with your subcontractors or your mentors in that mentor-protege relationship to see if they can fill some of those gaps. And then finally, if you don't have those resources, that's where WinBiz comes in. That is literally the only reason why our company exists. We have proposal managers, we have writers, we have graphic artists, desktop publishers, pricing guys, everybody, orals coaches, everything that you need. So if you just need one person to do graphics for you because you don't have someone in-house, or if you need that whole soup to nuts team, that give us a call. We'd love to talk to you, love to learn how we can help you win more business. That's all for me. Brandon?
Thanks, Jennifer. I do appreciate it. So up next, we got Samir Patel from Mobilization Capital. And he's going to talk to us today about how to get those contracts funded and some of the cool things that Mobilization Capital has done so far. All right, Samir, welcome aboard.
Thanks, Brandon. Glad to be here. And thanks, Jennifer, as well for setting this up for me. So I started Mobilization Capital to basically fund government contractors at all aspects and all arenas of their performance on that contract. And to add to what Jennifer said, the proposal stage is probably the most important because that's where you're planning out what you're going to do with this contract. And a huge part of that, as she mentioned, is money, making sure you have the right amount of money in place to perform. Because if you don't have money, you're not performing. And the worst situation you can get into is starting a contract with not enough money and then faltering in the middle and then not getting paid by the government for lack of performance. So just a quick overview of the contracting process. Jennifer mentioned the first two parts were research the customer's needs, the government agency that you're going after, developing your proposal, submitting your bid, and then the latter portions are pretty straightforward. You win the contract, you do the work. At some point, when you do the work or you complete the work, you invoice the government, and then you get paid thereafter. And so that cycle, this whole process can take anywhere from a month from winning a contract to even getting paid by the government, or it could take several years, depending on the size and complexity of the award. And so the thing I want to point out here is that the average contractor has to absorb expenses for about 60 to 70 days before they can expect to get paid, from the time they win a contract to the time they actually get their first invoice paid. And that 60 days is really critical because you've got payroll, you've got insurance costs, you've got all sorts of things that are going on to fulfill that contract, equipment rental, things like that, that need to be paid for. So where would you need money? Specifically, you need money perhaps right when you win the contract to mobilize. And that's what Mobilization Capital specializes in, right? It's in our name, mobilization. So we provide mobilization funding, and it goes to what I was talking about. You need to, get money to cover payroll for the first 2 weeks of an employee or first month of an employee working for you. You've got equipment rental, perhaps. You've got subscriptions that you may need to buy equipment if you're reselling it to the government. All sorts of expenses that you incur on that first stage, on the mobilization stage. And I would almost look at it as if you're starting another business, because that's essentially what, on a service contract, is essentially what you're doing. You're just starting a whole new business inside that contract. The second point at which you may need money is performance. So let's say you've done the work already, you had enough money to get to the work, to do the work, but then you need money for the next 30 days after you invoice the government. Or in the middle of performance, and let's say a classic example is payroll loans, where you've got a worker, they've worked for a month for you, and sometimes the government pays off cycle, meaning that their payment doesn't come in time for you to make payroll. And so you're in the middle of performing still. This employee is still doing the work for you and for the government, but the government hasn't paid you yet to pay the employee. And so can step in the form of providing a short 2-week payroll loan to cover that payroll of that employee. And then let's say in the third stage where you may need money is after invoicing. Let's say you've done all the work, you've sent a bill to the government, and you're just waiting to get paid, but you still have expenses to pay. Money's always going to be going out of your wallet, and so we come in and step in and purchase your invoice or factor your invoice if necessary to keep that cash flow going. The traditional ways of funding. So the first way, probably the most popular way, next slide please, is friends and family, right? You're scrounging for money from everybody you know. You're utilizing your relationships to get $25,000, $50,000 to cover all sorts of expenses. There's obviously pros and cons to this, right? The pro is with family and friends, if you've got a good relationship with them, you can get that money really quickly. And you don't have to fill out an application or anything like that. The disadvantage is though, is that what happens if something goes wrong inside your contract and the government's taking a little bit longer to pay, or there's something else going on that prevents you from getting paid. Now you've just, potentially lost a relationship. My personal rule of thumb is avoid family and friends when you can, because you're dealing with relationships, you're dealing with emotional bonds, and it's a very touchy subject. And so if you can avoid family and friends, borrowing from family and friends, I would do that. The other way is through the bank, and that's also a very frustrating subject for many government contractors, because the banks simply are not lending these days to government contractors, and lending in general, if you will. After the recession in 2009, 2010, tightened up their lending parameters. So, and on top of that, most banks consider anything under $200,000 more or less a microloan, and they don't want to deal with it because they don't make fees on anything with such smaller amounts. And so I know one guy, he went to like 6 different banks, and one of the banks forgot he was even sitting there waiting to see a loan officer. And then when he did talk to the other loan officers, he says, look, I've got this IDIQ for this product that I have. I had no idea what IDIQ meant, or what that actually meant in terms of money. And so loan officers are not sophisticated enough to know the ins and outs of government contracting. And so I alluded to this earlier actually. Mobilization capital can help because one, I used to be a government procurement official and a comptroller when I was in the military. And actually the genesis for mobilization capital started from a situation that occurred when I was in the military, and I saw that contractors had a hard time getting mobilized. And more so actually, a lot of them didn't even bother bidding on contracts because they knew they couldn't handle the 60-day problem before they get paid. And so you've got a lot of talented workers. You've got, you the contractor may know you can actually do the work, but when you know that you have to front the first $50,000 of a contract, that's prohibitive because you've got other things going on and $50,000 to invest in a contract up front. And that's where mobilization capital comes in, is that we understand government contracting and how it all works, and we know exactly where money can be inserted into the process. And so we've done 45 loans so far to date. Couple of comments that I get is contractors call us their secret weapon, because now they can go bid on all the contracts they can responsibly handle without worrying about the startup money at any point inside the contract as well. We've got a lot of contractors that come to us for payroll loans because they've submitted an invoice for the last month, but they haven't received that payment yet, but they've got payroll every 2 weeks and they can't afford not to pay their workers. And so coming to mobilization capital, we cover them for that 2-week period, give them the $35,000, $50,000 loans they need. And we do it within 48 hours. Whereas going to a bank, $50,000 loan for them, and you only need it for 2 weeks, they may want you to get a line of credit, but sometimes it's really hard to get or too long to obtain. And so what I'm really proud of at Mobilization Capital is that we've actually turned a couple contractors into millionaires at this point. because we've given them a lot of rope to go out and succeed. So mobilization capital doesn't need an invoice most of the time. Especially if you just won a contract, there's no way you've invoiced the government already. But our pre-invoice financing helps with covering payroll, equipment rentals and purchases, insurance and bond premiums, which are really important. You can't even start your contract without usually. What a lot of contractors overlook also is site surveys. So let's say you want a staffing contract at Aberdeen Proving Ground and you're in Atlanta or some other state. Yeah, you can find the employees, but you yourself have to go to that site of performance to make sure the computers are there, to make sure that there's enough space, to make sure that the resources that your employee or subcontractors would need to do the work, all those elements are in place. So, that can be expensive as well. Next. So a couple of real world examples. One guy won a staffing contract for a dining facility. He needed 2 months of payroll and administrative expenses to become. In his particular case, the first guy, he had a unique situation. He won the contract, I think, August 1st, and his period of performance began August 21st. So this guy in 3 weeks had to line up the employees, go ahead and do the site survey, travel to the Army facility. He had to also line up the other financing. That's a lot to do in 3 weeks for a staffing contract. But luckily he found us within 48 hours. I ascertained the situation and got him. In his particular case, I think he needed $20,000. We got it to him, and it was enough to cover payroll and to cover the admin expenses and legal expenses associated with that particular contract. And he was on his way, and he's successfully completing the contract right now. Of ours, she won an installation contract, so it was a one-time contract. It wasn't a service recurring. She was required, or she was awarded a contract to install some devices at a government facility, and she had enough money to do that, to get the devices installed and all that stuff, but she had to pay her subcontractor after she did the work. And of course, the government takes sometimes a long time to pay you, and your subcontractors may require payment within 5-10 days of doing the work. And so we stepped in. She showed me that she'd already billed the government, and we just fronted her to the cash. And then when she got paid by the government, she paid us back with our interest. So those are two examples. I think that covers most of what every contractor would come across. Here's what I want you to do right now. Go to mobilizationcapital.com and just get pre-qualified. Call us before you start bidding, or call us while you're bidding on contracts. The best way you can help yourself is by getting ahead of the curve. While we can work within 48 hours, it's a lot easier to work before you're awarded that contract. Us to really get going, really help you in a more efficient manner. My contact information is on here, spatel@mobilizationcapital.com, or you can email us at get_funded@capital.com and call us anytime. We're here for you.
All right. Thank you, Samir, and thank you to everybody that's out there watching us right now. That's a wrap. Make sure you stay tuned for more webinars. Real quick, this is our contact information from our two awesome guests, Samir Patel, when you need funding, and Jennifer Deli, proposal. So take a second, jot that information down, and this will be actually on YouTube later as well, so you can kind of comb back through it. And be sure to be on the lookout for our next webinar, and we'll see you next time.